So, welcome everyone to this episode of Midlife Unfiltered. I'm Erica Webb and I'm here with my always host, Anita. How are you, Anita?
I'm well this morning. Thank you, Erica, as the day's gone on. Had a bit of a rough night, I'll be honest, but I've recovered pretty well. So I'm really happy to have this conversation with you because it's been a little while since we were together and having a chat. So
It has. Yeah,
lovely.
you've taken on a couple of really awesome chats on your own, which has been awesome. I just was listening actually to the conversation that you had with your girlfriends last week. So thank you for doing those. And then you did the was it vein health? So thank you for taking all of that on.
Yeah,
Or capillary health. Yeah,
yeah, that's right. Blood vessel health with
blood vessels.
Marianne Jacobson, whom I just adore her work so much. She's incredible. So yes, we've had some different chats, quite wildly diverse topics. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And so today we're coming back to you and me chatting about things that are on our minds and on our hearts. And I brought up the idea of talking about pausing. And I think it'll be interesting to have this conversation because there's lots of different ways to think about pausing in terms of small pauses, big pauses, what we do in the pause, how we give ourselves permission to take a pause. But pausing and this idea of creating some space for ourselves in order to be mindful of, ourselves and the choices that we're making and what it is that we want. And I think that having this conversation around the context of midlife is really important. And before we started recording, you asked me, what was the catalyst for this? And I was sharing with you that part of the reason that this has been on my mind is because I've gotten really busy recently. And, I'm nearing sort of full bookings in my counseling space. Um, I'm still working with my online membership program and being a mum of two, school-aged kids. And life just suddenly felt very, very full and very, very busy. And one of the things that has always been an anchor for me is like meditation. And I think I've said it before to you. I don't really like the word meditation, so I don't use that word with myself very often. But pausing, essentially, is one of the things that's been really important to me. That's where I kind of hear myself. That's where I feel like I can get in contact with my intuition, my gut feel. It's where I feel, some peace. And I just wasn't really doing it very often, or it was feeling harder and harder to come by. And so I felt a little bit like I was swept up in the swept up in the waves of life a little bit and sort of not feeling as conscious about my moment by moment choices. Um, and it felt like I had this moment of recognizing like I could actually just live like that, right? I could literally I could just like live the next 40 years in a bit of a blur and in a bit of a haze. But I had to make a conscious choice to pause. And so I've really tried to build that back in because it was something that I used to do really naturally and almost a little bit without thinking about it. And now I'm finding I have to be a lot more intentional about it because the schedule's just fuller and, there's just more things going on. So that's the context, I guess, for it. But I'm talking about little pauses in the day. And I think that this conversation's a little bit bigger than that because as I was thinking about pausing and what it means, I was also thinking about the way that I teach movement. And in my classes, I often invite pauses to check in with how your body is feeling, with how you are feeling, with how your kind of, things are changing in yourself. And so I was thinking about how sometimes when we're so focused on forward momentum, we also miss pausing in a way that helps us to see where we've come from, where we want to go. And I was also reflecting on your kind of bigger pause, I guess, as you've made a little bit of a change to the way that you work. And so I'm curious when I talk about pausing, what comes up for you? Because I'm thinking that it might be slightly different to what I've shared, and so I'm really curious what pops up for you.
What pops up for me, I think is the word countercultural straight away.
Mhm.
So I believe that we live in a world that values busyness, that values always having something to do, whether it's serving us well, like you alluded to, or not, and busyness as a distraction to stop us from really calling to question and to discovering a bit more about who we are and what we need. And I think there's a lot of judgment in that. What will people think if I'm not doing something? Because as you said, you're doing a lot of doing, and I think we live in a doing culture. When you see someone for the first time, you go, "Hello, how are you? And what is it that you do?" Yeah, we talked about that before. And instead of saying what brings you joy, what makes you happy, right?
Mm.
So there's so much wrapped up in the expectations and the Western world that we live in where doing is so highly valued. But for me, what I've come to learn in the wisdom of my bigger pause, it's been almost 2 years now, that that's just such a superficial layer. And you've alluded to that in the intro. It's sort of like I used to do it deliberately with intention because it gave me some other benefits. But now it's kind of like blanketing and weighing me down. All the doing is weighing me down. It's almost suffocating to the point where I'm finding it hard to come up and get air and create that space, even small pauses. Um, that's what comes to mind. I think we live still in that context of doing is fucking great, and if you're doing it, you're doing great. And if you stop, you're a lazy shit, and you're not offering any value, which is just crap, right? It's absolute
Yeah.
bum. So that's what immediately springs to mind. So I'm glad that you offered this up as a topic of conversation because I think we need to be countercultural on this because of the benefits that come with it. Yeah, there's so many benefits that come with it.
There are, and I think your point about knowing ourselves is a really interesting one, of like, um, that's something that maybe I hadn't appreciated this part of it until you just said that. But since finding out that my dad is not my dad and all of the sort of stuff that's gone along with that, I've had a bit of an identity crisis.
Mm.
And I'm still working through that, this question of like, who actually am I? What do I like? What do I want? Has really surfaced. And I think that's quite common in midlife anyway. But then I had that added layer, right?
Mm.
And I think what I have become aware of around that identity piece is that how do you know who you are if you don't stop to listen to what's present in you? You
Mm.
know, I realized that I wasn't reading, and reading is a huge part of my identity. It's a huge part of how I see myself, but I wasn't doing it. I wasn't doing some of the other things that have long been a part of my identity, like, weight training and meditating and, certain things that just had been such a core part of how I saw myself. And so I think that that's a really, really important point is in midlife, where there is this potential to have a little bit of an identity crisis of sorts, and where our roles are changing, our perception of, you know, what's right and wrong maybe even changes, our recognition that we have been kind of turned into something almost by the world because of the expectations of society. All of that we start to pull apart. But
Mm.
how do we get in touch with what is true for us if we're not quiet enough
Yeah,
to hear it?
to listen. Yep.
Um, yeah, I think that's really important. And, I want to point out too, I recently obviously talked on the podcast about my ADHD and autism diagnoses. And I think for me, being able to see my inability to pause sometimes a little bit through that lens as well of going, okay, well, there is that challenge, that added challenge for me, has been really powerful too, because I see now that, part of the reason why that feels hard is because of my split attention. I'm constantly thinking about multiple things. So it's taken a little bit of the shame out of it for me for sure. Um, But yeah, I do. I really think that that identity piece is really interesting, and I'd be curious. I didn't not pre-warn you. So if you don't want to answer this question, that's okay. But I'm curious in your 2-year sort of career pause, what you've learned about yourself that you might not have learned or seen or experienced or appreciated if you hadn't taken that pause.
I think I've learned to love myself a lot more. I think that's
I love that answer.
ultimately, yeah, I think ultimately that's where it's all kind of bubbled up to. That's the, what do they call it? The 30,000 foot view. Um,
Mm,
yeah, I think so. And appreciate um, me as a person. Going back to your point about identity, now it's more around um, the value I bring and who I am, not attached to the label that I previously had as a business owner and, you know, body confidence ambassador and swimwear retailer and all of those labels that came alongside with the business side of it. So, and I think I'm a better person for it. I really do. I think I'm in tune with myself a lot more. Through giving myself that gift of a bigger pause. And I realize it's a privilege to be able to have that. And that's where I think, to your point of creating the smaller pauses, also would uh, compound. You'd have compound benefits from having those smaller pauses. So even if you are stretched, and we're in a different phase of or segment of midlife. We've talked about that too. So I'm nearly 60 and you're just 40. So, if I like midlife being sort of 35, that perimenopausal, potentially that perimenopausal time year to early 70s, because we're living longer.
yeah,
I just think it's such a broad
yeah.
section, segment of phase of life now. Um, yeah, and so there's different demands and there's different priorities that come with that. But I think what you said that is invaluable is it's in the pausing that you can listen and really identify with greater clarity what is important to help guide you in all the busyness as well. So you can prioritize and go, okay, I might be really busy, but what really matters most and what's going to, move the needle more for me, whether that's personally or in business or for me as a whole, yeah. Does that
Mhm.
make sense?
100%. I really like that. And it's interesting, over the weekend, I had an experience where there was just a million things to do, right? So I've had a lot of assignments due and I'd submitted those. And so the house was a little bit of a disaster because I had really hyper focused on my
Yep. That was
assignments
your
and
priority.
that
Yeah.
left everything else. And then I was like, I really was intentional about taking a pause and I spent my afternoon on the couch reading a new book. And I don't think I would have done that had it not been for the intentional pause. Because in that intentional pause, I was able to connect with what really mattered to me in the moment.
Mm.
And I sat amongst mess, like there was a lot of mess, there was a lot of washing I needed to do, there were, dishes to be done, there was a lot of stuff. Um, but I paused long enough to sort of question with myself, what's going to make me feel good now? And sometimes the answer would be doing the jobs, right? But in that moment, it would feel so good right now just to sit down on the couch, put a cozy blanket on, and read a book. And I think I was only able to do it with the kind of presence that I ended up with because it was so conscious. It was really a conscious choice to serve myself
Mhm.
in a lot of ways. And I found that over the last few weeks, since I've been a lot more intentional about taking those pauses, I've had quite a few experiences like that where I've been able to extract myself from what feels very chaotic in terms of just an abundance of things to be dealt with or decisions to be made or, I've been able to kind of pull back a little bit and see, yeah, like what is really important right now. Everything's kind of important on some level, but like what's really important. And in that process, very much prioritizing my well-being, particularly my mental health. So I think that it's like so in the yoga world, which is obviously part of my world, oftentimes when you start a class, and you would know this, Anita, you do yoga. Oftentimes when we start a class or in the middle of a class or at the end of the class, a teacher will often invite you to check in and to notice how you feel. And I have this beautiful dear friend who used to always, she was also a yoga teacher, and she used to always describe that moment as being like when you're about to program something into the GPS on your car or on your phone. You have to know where you're starting in order to be able to get somewhere else, right? If you don't know where you're starting, the directions mean nothing
Yeah.
because you can't do it. So I always think of that. I always think of her saying that when I think about pausing, because it's this way that we can kind of reorient to like, oh, here I am, you know, here I am. This is what I'm experiencing. And then if we have goals or values or, priorities that we then can sort of redirect ourselves to, we do it from that conscious place. Whereas I think for most of us, when we're in autopilot,
Mm.
there isn't that moment. And so we miss the sign of like, you're approaching burnout. We miss the sign of you do that, you're going to feel an awful lot of resentment.
Mm.
You do that, you're going to, end up here. And then we think it's just the world around us that's the problem. And we kind of can't see past those circumstances. So I think it's a really powerful way of locating yourself, not just in space and time, but just sort of like locating yourself and then figuring out, given what I know I want to feel, to, embody, to experience, whatever, what next? What now?
What next?
So,
Yeah. What's your
yeah, it
next
puts you in the
honest
driver's seat.
step? Yeah. And I read that today in a post on Substack. I think it's the old man or something. I'll put it in the notes, but that was it. He talked about taking the next honest step, and I
Mm,
love the word honest in all of that. And that's kind of what you're saying now is what's true to me, what
yeah,
feels right, what's true to me, what's honest for me
yeah.
as my next step. I think it's so valuable. Yeah, that's awesome.
That's really
Honest.
cool. Yeah, I like that. I hadn't seen that post. Honesty is one of my top values. And I so when I heard you say that, I think, yeah, that to me, it sort of speaks to something that we talk about often on this podcast, which is values and living in a life more aligned with our values. And I think that's what the pause allows us to do, right? How do you make a conscious, honest step towards your values, your goals, whatever, if you don't know how you are?
Mm, mm,
You can't do that, right? How do
mm.
you know if you're about to take an honest step if you haven't had a chance to check in and notice what's true for you? You can't do that.
No. Or to just
Um,
pause, because often
yeah,
at the beginning of a meditation or yoga practice, you're invited to just sit and tune in with your breath. So even that is kind of like what you were talking, where am I at right now? How do I feel? But just that simple act of taking literally 10 seconds to sit
yes,
and check in with your breath and anchor down and go, okay, here I am. And breath work is a big part of that.
yeah.
You,
And that can be that simple, Anita, right? It can
mm,
literally be when we talk about a pause, it can be a pause of one breath,
mm-hmm.
or it can be a 2-year pause, like whatever. There's so many variations on that, but it doesn't have to be like, I need to, sit for 10 minutes. It can be for sure, but it literally can be a breath. You're about to say something profound. I could feel it.
I don't know about profound, but I was going to say something else came to mind as you were talking about that, because I think we can either choose and make it intentional and almost like preventative for our mental health and overall well-being to incorporate it into, not regular, but, intentional practice and be mindful of it. Or the world or nature will do it for us, where I recently caught up with a friend in Canberra, and she said to me, we're so aligned in the same space. She's a couple of years older than me, but she recently fell off a ladder and broke 17 bones in her body.
Oh
I
my
know.
gosh.
So she had to rebuild and, get strength and come back from that. And she said it was the greatest gift. Would you expect someone to say that after they'd broken 17 bones in their body? She said it was the greatest gift because it made her
Pause.
pause, right? It was a forced pause. And with that, she took the opportunity to ask some pretty big questions and to realign herself with her values. And that's
Mm,
how she's now stepping forward with greater honesty. So,
wow.
yeah, I love her story and quite extreme. But sometimes I think, the universe goes, well, if you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it for you. And we know burnout is a really big part of modern life as well. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. Wow. That is a very extreme way to end up in a pause, but I can imagine very effective. Made me think too of one of the things that maybe is a like when people hear us talk about this, maybe an objection that I think I could hear coming through the phone, um, which is that sometimes it's very hard to access how you feel. Right? That's a real challenge sometimes for people.
Yes. Yeah.
So that idea of pausing to check in, it's like, I don't know what I'm looking for. And so I wanted to just take the opportunity to point that out because I do think for those of us who have practiced long enough that we have a sense of what we're looking for or what we're listening for, or there's some capacity for that. Not everybody does have that capacity right in the moment. And so it can feel a little bit uncomfortable to pause to listen
Yeah.
for
Very
what, right?
uncomfortable. Super uncomfortable. It's
And it's
not
uncomfortable
easy.
even if you do know what to listen for, right? It can
Yes,
be really uncomfortable
absolutely.
because
Mhm.
you might access sadness that you'd really rather avoid. You might access grief that you would really rather avoid. You might access a sense of disappointment in yourself that you would really rather avoid. And so I think that it's important to call that out because
Mhm.
it's not like, it's all this, it's just peace and rainbows and unicorns and it's all just very easy. I think sometimes it can be quite confronting to pause. That's why we don't do it.
Exactly. That's right. Exactly.
Precisely. So if you're listening and you're thinking that, like, you're not alone at all in that. That is very human. Um, and I think it's still worth trying. If you need support to do that, then, use support. But I do think that we don't get better at listening by not listening. We get better at listening to ourselves by giving ourselves the opportunity to hear something that's there. And so even if all that happens is you pause and you go, I don't feel any the wiser,
Mhm.
but I took
Mhm.
the moment. Cool, that's fine.
Mhm. Mhm.
You will attune your ear to that process over time.
Mm. Yeah, 100%. I find that too. Some days I'll stop and there's nothing. Like it's absolute silence. And then other days, there's tears because I lost my dad
Mhm.
earlier this year and I will immediately think of him. So,
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. There's all these mixed emotions and feelings that come up. But I think feeling comfortable in the not knowing and in the silence is also something that it's almost a skill that we need, that we develop over time, to be
Yeah.
comfortable with the silence. Um,
Or alternatively, the cacophony. You know, for some people, they might be like, I can't even get there's too much noise. So it could be either way, right? It could be that there's too much noise, or it feels like silence, or it feels like background noise that you can't decipher. Um,
I'm going to
yeah.
be a bit of a, I don't know, firm but fair here. I think too, a lot of time is wasted on things that don't matter, things that are out of our control, things that don't contribute to us feeling good about ourselves or giving us any new direction or clarity or whatever, or just
Mhm.
having a positive effect on ourselves. I think we just need to be smarter about the use of our time, you know?
Mhm.
So instead of, if you want to sit down and you want to scroll through your phone, fine. I'm not judging that. That's fine. But be aware that we all have 24 hours in a day. And yes, I know there are big priorities in all of that. But I think you can carve out 1 minute or 2 minutes in 24 hours to serve you well with a conscious cause.
Yeah. And I think it's important too to recognize how you pause can be very unique to you. You know, your pause might be a walk in nature where you're actually physically moving, but you
Mm.
can hear yourself. It might be, my preferred method of pause is literally to sit with my eyes closed. But for some people, that's intolerable, So it doesn't have to be a pause in the truest sense of the word. It can be movement. Your yoga practice can be a pause.
Mm.
It's more about how do you cut through the habitual grind
Busyness. Yeah.
rather than it being, you know, deep silence, physical stillness. It doesn't have to be that. It can be that, but it doesn't have to be that. So I think, if there's a sense of resistance around pausing too, think about what you're demanding of yourself in that. Can you be more curious about what would be appropriate for your neurotype, for your preferences? A lot of people who are neurodivergent, sitting and meditating is just like kind of not a thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I'm neurodivergent and I do like it, but I've spent a lot of years sort of practicing. And so walking in nature might be the way that you do that. It might be listening to your favorite song and, just closing your eyes and feeling that and
Mhm.
noticing what's present in your body. So there's lots and lots of different ways to do it. But I guess the common thread is where can you hear yourself? Where can you hear um, the opportunities for self-knowing, for self-love, as you talked about earlier, and even just the whispers of like, this is what I need, this is what I need. And I think that's what I've been trying to keep my ear out for is what do I honestly need? Is it, you know, any number of things. And so yeah. I mean, we could talk about this for hours,
I know.
obviously, couldn't we, Anita? But I think it's such a great exploration, and I think so vital in every stage of life. But I think in midlife, where we've hit our certain, for most of us, we have a level of routine and expectation and embeddedness of our everything, and so it can be an interesting time to start to introduce more pauses. So that we can see with intention where it is we want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Get that clarity. And I think too, we might have had the routines, but I know a little bit further along in midlife, those routines get blown up, in a lot of
Mm.
ways. And new routines start. Like my new routines look very different. Now my routines involve caring for my elderly parent, my elderly mum, and, working through all the stuff with dad and my in-laws and friends. So, like it's a very different routine now to what it
Mhm.
was when I was, your age in my early
Yeah,
40s. Very, very different. So I think the power in the pause in menopause transition is it comes with just using it as an anchor as well in all of that whirring around and in all of the change. Because it might not just be in the busyness that we need it, it's in the big chunks of change that we have to navigate as well as life just can completely upend and
absolutely.
yeah, too. So
Yeah,
yeah, we need our
yeah,
pause. Mm.
we do. We do.
Mm.
This has been fun.
It's been great. Yeah, yeah. I hope that we've managed to um, spark a few thoughts and to have people think, yeah, what do I need right now? What can I do to carve a little bit of time out to pause for me in my day, letting go of other things that I'm doing to create that space? Because that's what it's about, isn't it, really? What can I let go
Yeah,
to create that space? Like you let go of doing the washing and all the other things that were piling up, and you chose to read because that brings you joy. So
yeah.
I think it's that. It's what can I carve out and make a priority for me. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those listening, if you want to share with us how you do that, I would love to hear it because I think that could be potentially really helpful for others is to read or to hear how do you do that? Because I do think the ways that we can pause are many. And so, yeah, be super curious to hear how you do that or how you might do that if you're going to introduce it. So,
Yeah. Love
yeah,
that. Great. Well, thank you, Erica. Great chat
thank
as
you.
always.
So nice to
And
see your face.
yeah, likewise. Well, yeah, we'll come back again next week for another chat as well. But for now, thank you so much for watching the replay and tuning in. We really appreciate you. See
See
you
you
later.
soon.
Bye.
Bye.